1917 was a big year for Russia. It's very personal to me because my grandpa came over from Russia about that year, a couple of years after he came over from Russia. That was the year when the Russian Revolution started. The Communist Party was rising in Russia, and Tsar Nicholas II was in power at the time. He was very one-sided. He was much of a dictator himself, but many of the people in Russia at that time were very poor, didn't have much food or money. All of the land was given to nobles, so many of the peasants and middle-class people didn't even have land themselves, which made it very hard for people to make money. During that time, the Communist Party realized what was going on and noticed a lot of people dying from hunger, a lot of people living out in the streets and not having any money. And they also recognized the deaths that were racking up due to the Tsar getting rid of people in this sort of sense. You might have heard of Rasputin, which was a monk with a previous Tsar before Tsar Nicholas, and this monk in particular was a kind of a assistant. Really, just told the Tsar what to do a lot of the time, and a lot of the time it was killing people and murdering a lot of people back in the day. And the communists saw this and really took it in a really bad way. This is what really started the communist revolution. At this time, my grandpa and his family were in Russia. They were landowners themselves, and they actually were fairly wealthy people. So my grandpa was very much involved in this whole revolution at the time. The communists at the time were split up between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks were more of a passive group, where the Bolsheviks were more of a radical group that believed in violence. Kind of like our Martin Luther King was more of the passive one, and Malcolm X was more of a aggressive in our time in the U.S. But as far as that went, there was a lot of disagreements between both the groups. The Bolsheviks had an uprising, and it was called the March Revolution. At this time, in March, there was a big outcry by all the people, all the workers and the peasants and everything, and that is when the violence started to break out, and eventually the communists forced Tsar Nicholas II out of office and into exile, where eventually he was killed in the Ural Mountains. At this time, Vladimir Lenin, which most of you know, was in Switzerland and also a little bit of Germany, writing at the time, but he was considered part of the Bolshevik group, where eventually he made his way back to Russia, and this really ignited a lot more revolution. So at this time, a kind of a preliminary government was put in place, and it was very unstable, wasn't working very well. Finally, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were talking a lot more and trying to decide what was going to happen. And so Vladimir Lenin comes in. He has a huge speech that really impacts a lot of people, and a lot of people don't understand. And also during this time, World War I was going on, and there was a separation between people who wanted Russia to pull out and wanted Russia to keep going in World War I. And also a lot of influences from the Allies with Russia were having an impact on what was going on too, because America and France and a couple other nations were wanting Russia to keep going in the war, obviously. But so this really divided a lot of people. Vladimir Lenin really upset a lot of people with some of his speeches, and eventually he had to leave Russia again to sneak out so he wouldn't be killed, pretty much. And this is when Leon Trotsky kind of took over, who was at the time leader of the Mensheviks. He was in power for a while, and but a lot of things started to fall apart. And in November of 1917 is when Lenin came back into the country. It really impacted what was going on at the time. And eventually the Bolsheviks forced out the Mensheviks from power and took over. And this is when Vladimir Lenin took power and had a lot of assistance, as far as like Joseph Stalin was one of his assistants, who later came into power during the communist rule, and he became pretty much an icon in Russia, with statues everywhere and banners and everything like that, all this propaganda. Finally, he took power, the Communist Party ruled, and that forced my grandpa out, because he was with the White Army for the Tsar. He was a medical assistant during the whole war between the White Army and the Red Army, and he was eventually forced out. He moved into Istanbul and eventually made his way over to the Americas. And finally Lenin took over and ended the revolution until later years, when obviously Boris Yeltsin took over as the Republic ended. So it was a long battle and a long revolution, but it eventually ended, and a lot of blood was shed, which didn't have to be, but I'm glad my grandpa made it out, and I'm glad he came to the States so I could live here myself. Thank you.